In this episode of the Encounter Report, 3 adventurers join the Tripath in Octopath Traveler 1. There's Axelrod, your humble narrator, Crayson, the marathon runner, and Caslo25, the dog whisperer. Each of us played the game blind on the Switch, and with that out of the way, one of our Chapter 1s is gonna knock your socks off. First up are battle types, and we can already see some time discrepancies. Despite having the least amount of random encounters, Caslo25 logs the highest time within them. This is largely due to the fact that Caslo25 has the highest average time in random encounters, sitting at 2 minutes 21 seconds. The next highest was myself at 2 minutes 5 seconds, and Crayson at 1 minute 57 seconds. It's also worth noting that Caslo25 has the lowest boss times, and that margin could be even larger. For myself, I had multiple attempts against the subclass bosses that I didn't have footage of, based on the word of mouth of my past self. Approximately 8 to 9 attempts were on the Rune Lord, 3 to 4 on the Starseer, and 3 for the Warbringer. That would be upwards of 5 hours of attempts depending on how far into the fight I got. So there's that. On Crayson's end, he actually found himself having the highest average boss time at 12 minutes 3 seconds, compared to Caslo25's 9 minutes 55 seconds and my 9 minutes 38 seconds. This will likely explain why his boss times are so high despite having the least amount of boss encounters. We will also get to the nitty-gritty later, but despite all of us having a very similar strategy, we all took it in different directions. For battle locations, we can see where encounters were taking place. In this instance, world map encounters were logged as effectively every outdoor area surrounding towns. Exceptions to that were forests, which were labeled as dungeons. And since only a handful of bosses existed outside of dungeons, that's where the bulk of the time resides. The large differences between Caslo25 and the rest of us is largely due to duels, of which are mostly optional fights where we would beat people to get into their houses. Caslo25 actually didn't do a single duel on screen, but it's very likely that he brought the ruckus off of camera. Combat types are up next so that we can see the distribution of how encounters conclude, and as a reminder, my deaths should be much higher in both total encounters and total time based on footage that wasn't available. Although, even without that information, each one of us manages to carve out a pocket of their own. I show the highest times in fight and death encounters, which either means fights were going really well until they didn't, or I just refused to give up on those death attempts. Grayson doesn't let us down with his 32% of encounters ran from, which is pretty impressive. His first encounter ran from was in Chapter 1, but running became very common in Chapter 2, with almost every encounter in Chapter 3 and 4 ran from. Caslo25 sports not only the least amount of encounters ran from, but the least amount of deaths as well. In fact, if we exclude the post-game portion, his deaths go down to 1 and his runs to 2, of which 1 was by accident. Following that up are subtypes, where we can see some of the extra stuff. Here we can finally reveal that everyone did their fair share of grinding. In Crayson's case, the Orlick boss fight for Therion's Chapter 2 gave him some trouble. Additionally, he grinded up Olberic's levels for his Chapter 2 due to being underleveled for some required duels. The last bit of grinding would come up in Olberic's Chapter 3 for the boss and duel, as well as several encounters before moving on to the next chapter. In this case, he had recognized he was running from a lot of battles and chose to make up for some of the lost ground in the Lizardman Den, which provided enemy weaknesses he could easily exploit. For myself, I effectively only grinded off-screen to get Haunted powerful enough to not die in her duels in Chapter 2 and 3. For Caslo25, his off-screen grinding was plentiful. Based on save times, he spent 32 hours off-camera, which accounted for 35 levels for the main game and another 27 levels for the post-game, spread across multiple characters and ranges. I also need to throw it out there that the advantage and back attack numbers aren't completely accurate here. While there is a skill to avoid getting back attacks, I was pretty terrible at catching both of these encounter types. We also have party composition, and as previously mentioned, every one of us had a very similar setup. For myself, I had Ophelia, Cyrus, Olberic, and Therion. Crayson had Haunted, Ophelia, Cyrus, and Therion, while Caslo25 had Cyrus, Ophelia, Primrose, and Therion. And as we can see from the encounter numbers, both Crayson and myself opted for the 3 main members with a rotating 4th, while Caslo25 opted to grind everyone to similar levels. There's also the usage of the evasive maneuvers skill. For Caslo25, he rarely used it, while I used it in a fair chunk of areas, especially ones I'd already been in. For Crayson, he effectively had it on for the entire game, which brings an interesting reflection on his encounter numbers. To break it down further, there's also the chapter data which will cycle by. I think it's worth paying special attention to the run percent and total encounters, as we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into strategy here. On my end, I built Cyrus to be my primary damage dealer, which is actually consistent amongst all of us. Cyrus doubled as a sorcerer, and combined with the cleric's divine skill, he was hitting enemies 6 times a turn for a total of 30,000 damage or more. Ophelia doubled as an apothecary and was entirely support, while Oberic was a dancer who was in charge of buffing Cyrus and using a divine skill here and there for damage. Then Therian was my secondary damage dealer, while also using hunter skills to debuff. Crayson also empowered Cyrus, who was a cleric, but utilized Ophelia as not only a healer, but a secondary scholar. This meant that his main damage output consisted of fire, ice, lightning, and holy for magic damage. For weapons, he has Honnet as a warrior and Therian as a dancer, but despite a similar setup, his strategy differed a great deal. He had a very high reliance on items as a whole, to the point where he actually ran out of soul stones in the playthrough. These were used to shore up some of the damage types he was missing, but also to greatly increase his damage output. These were used as early as Chapter 2s, and kept up until he effectively ran out on his first Chapter 4 fight. Outside of that, the most notable strategy differences was his overall lack of using divine skills. Once Chapter 3 came around, he began using them at a higher rate. However, despite having Therian as his 4th party member, I also noticed that Crayson never used the 2-hit moves HP Thief or Steal SP, which stood out a lot since he would auto-attack instead. On Caslo25's side, his utilization of Cyrus was the strongest out of all of us. On some bosses, he was outputting 90,000 damage without using the cleric's divine skill. And speaking of which, this was never an ability he actually used despite multiple chances to do so. Then again, it's not like he necessarily needed it. However, to supplement Cyrus's damage, he had Ophelia as a scholar for a while before swapping to Starseer. He also had Primrose as a cleric, which afforded him a lot of flexibility that I didn't have. The number of enemies is also going to cycle by. Here, the spread leaned more towards 3 and 4 enemy encounters. A sizable amount of bosses were 3 and 1 enemy encounters, which is reflected in the total times. And for the final combined stats, we can see a better view of a certain difficulty level that we all faced. Even though all of us didn't have great struggles with the game, the total character deaths accurately portrays how strong each of us felt in battle and quantifies what degree of struggle we had to deal with. And that's the Octopath Traveler 1 encounter report. I hope you visit everyone's channels and social media to praise them for all this wonderful data. With another report done, I betten you're glad I didn't recite in this entire script like Honnet, letting that praise shower in. Thanks for watching, appreciate it, see you on the next video.